Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to have folks joining us today for our second event in the speaker series. I'm pulling up my opening remarks as we speak because I clicked the wrong thing as it goes. Here we go. So welcome to the second event in this year's Writers Across the Curriculum Speaker Series, hosted by the Writing Center at Michigan State University. My name is Dr. Karen Murawski-Rigney. I'm one of the two associate directors of the Writing Center here at MSU, and I'm very glad to welcome you all to today's event. I'd like to thank the College of Arts and Letters Engaged Pedagogy and Programming Grant Fund for making this series possible, and would also like to thank the following members of our Writing Center team for all their support. Dr. Trixie Long-Smith, our director, Dr. Grace Pregent, my co-associate director, Philip Montgomery, our assistant director, and Orville Cayedito and Nicole Golden, our amazing professional development coordinators. This event would not be possible without all of their contributions. I'd like to direct your attention to the email where you received your Zoom link to join us today. In that email, there is information on how to navigate our webinar space. I hope you'll find it helpful. That same information houses links to materials Dr. Poe would like you to access and use during her talk, like her slides. So you'll want to keep it handy. We can relink it in the chat for expediency's sake. I'd also like to note that today's talk will be recorded so we can share the event asynchronously via our YouTube channel and our website. And lastly, after our time together ends, we will reach out to you again via email with a response survey regarding today's event. So this speaker series is the fourth grant-funded speaker series we've hosted here at the Writing Center at MSU. Each year, we've asked ourselves, what questions are urgent in our field? Where should we be learning more? Where should we be investing our energy and our attention? Over time, we've held speaker series on language justice, the work of storytelling, and disability justice. This year's turn toward Tier 2 writing, or writing across the curriculum, or writing in the disciplines, was designed with the urgency we feel as Writing Center practitioners to meet the moment our students and our consultants are in today. The pandemic has changed education. It's changed educators, it's changed students, it's changed our starting lines and our points of engagement. These changes require a recursive process of coming to know who our writers are and what they need from us. Because we work with writers from all majors and departments in a Writing Center, this year's speaker series is meant to help us refocus our work and refine our understanding of our shared writing communities. So Dr. Mya Poe is here with us today. Dr. Poe is an associate professor of English at Northeastern University. For more than 20 years, she's been an advocate for justice-oriented writing assessment practices. Through her research on disparate impact in placement testing to recent work on justice-oriented anti-racist validity in large-scale testing, Mya has sought collaborative interdisciplinary partnerships. For Mya, collaboration should not merely represent an important disciplinary practice, but also a culturally relevant practice for meaning making. Her research on scientific communication has also been deeply collaborative, especially in her research on student writing development in the sciences. Her recent work in scientific communication looks at publishing ethics and explores the potential of a decolonial option in the teaching of scientific communication. Her co-authored and co-edited books include Learning to Communicate in Science and Engineering, Race and Writing Assessment, Social Justice and the Advancement of Opportunity, and Writing Placement in Two-Year Colleges, the Pursuit of Equity in Post-Secondary Education. Her scholarship has appeared in journals such as College Composition and Communication, Educational Assessment, and Assessing Writing. She's also guest edited special issues of Research in the Teaching of English and College English, dedicated to social justice, diversity, and writing assessment. She's a series co-editor of the Oxford Brief Guides to Writing in the Disciplines and the incoming co-editor of Written Communication. Her research has received funding from the Northeastern College of Humanities and Social Sciences, College Composition and Communication, MIT School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Penn State Institute for the Arts and Humanities. Her teaching and service have been recognized with the Northeastern University Teaching Excellence Award, the Northeastern College of Social Sciences and Humanities Outstanding Teaching Award, and the MIT Infinite Mile Award for Continued Outstanding Service and Innovative Teaching. We are so pleased to have her with us today and to kick off our second speaker event with her this afternoon. So without further ado, I will turn the virtual floor over to Dr. Poe.
Great, thanks, Karen. Can you hear me okay? I'm looking at Karen. All good? All right, awesome. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. And if you've ever been to a talk I've given before, first of all, I'm going to say I talk fast. This is part of my show. That's why I have slides available. If we run out of time today for all of your questions, I'm happy to answer them over email or through a Google Doc. So Karen's going to collect the questions today, and I'll make sure that I get to them. I'm really delighted that I'm following on the heels of Joanna Wolf's talk, because Joanna gave a really nice State of the Union kind of talk about kind of where scientific communication is today in terms of textual practices. My talk today is going to say kind of where is it headed? So I see these talks really nice and complementary to one another. And I'll just say one other thing, and then I'm going to launch here. And that is, as someone who is an incoming journal editor, I'm really interested in the issues that I talk about today, because I think about scientific communication is always on the forefront, given the simple amount of scale of what comes into scientific journals. And those of us who are running social science journals, particularly international social science journals that get a lot of submissions, we can learn from what scientific practices are today, publishing practices. Before what thing I do, go here. Right. So I begin all my talks in this day and age with an acknowledgements slide, which just says there's so many people that inform our work, right, that we oftentimes do not actually acknowledge in our presentations, but I want to make a space for them, because we don't just necessarily stand on the shoulders of giants, we also stand in solidarity with our mentors and our collaborators. So I would like to take a moment to do that now for folks like Norbert Elliott, as well as Maria Elena Oliveira, Jennifer Randall, many others that are definitely important to my work today. Thank you. So let's talk about the scientific presentation, the scientific work today. So today I'm going to talk about three things. And the first one is that the effect of what's been known as pandemic publishing has had on innovations in peer review. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement, a kind of larger racial reckoning, what that has meant for scientific communication. And the third thing I'm going to talk about today is challenges to English-only norms in scientific publishing. So let's get started. So pandemic publishing and innovations in peer review. So think about this as we begin this conversation. What do you think of when you think of peer review? What peer review processes do you think of? Right? Keep that in mind as I begin. All right, so pandemic publishing. So this is a slide that captures what has been labeled pandemic publishing, which is this sheer humongous number of publications that have come in since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. You see, according here to the Dimensions server, that to date, as it's just the other day, there's been now more than 1.4 million publications, and note their preprints form a not insignificant number of publications that have come out about COVID-19. It's been a crush on scientific journals to try to deal with kind of all this material that's being published. And to put on a more finer point on this, there's been some recent research that was started in 2020, this piece by Holly Elise, and it was followed up by this piece by Adam Pellew and colleagues, that's saying that it's not just the quantity, it's also had this pandemic publishers really put this incredible pressure on getting things through that pipeline, or that kind of pathway, as we might call it, to getting things into print. And matter of fact, those COVID-19 publications sometimes have an average peer review time of only 6 days. It's an enormous amount of pressure on the system that's had to undergo. I'll go this way, sorry. And in this, as for example, as John Inglis, who's co-founder of medRxiv and bioRxiv and executive director of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press, has said, the need for speed has put considerable pressure on typical peer review systems that will be hard to sustain. It's possible, he says, that the events of this year, meaning 2020, will add momentum to new ways of conducting peer review after results have been disseminated as preprints. And I think he's absolutely prescient, and I'm going to talk here a little bit about in those innovations in peer review that we're already beginning to see happen. To be clear, I want to say this is all new. Innovation has long been a part of scientific publishing practices, right? Traditional peer review in scientific publishing has been one that's been mediated by a journal and journal editors. It's captured here in the standards for the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, in which they define peer review. Because peer review is the critical assessment of manuscripts submitted to journals by experts who are usually not part of the editorial staff. Because unbiased, independent critical assessment is an intrinsic part of all scholarly work, including scientific research, peer review is an important extension of scientific process. This is definitely so much a hallmark of what we think of as what scientific peer review is today, but it's also changing. And I think it's nicely, this infographic from COPE, which is the Committee on Publishing Ethics, which is a global consortium of publishers, provides ethical guidance on things like author disputes and so on, has this nice infographic of different kinds of peer review that now are part of scientific publishing, whether it be a peer review at preprint stage, or review pre-publication or post-publication review. And the infographic captures kind of thinking about who's owning peer review at these different stages now, and is it anonymized or is it not anonymized along the way? Post-publication peer review has been around for more than 20 years, and I think Faculty of 1000 is a good model of what post-publication peer review has typically looked like. In this case, Faculty 1000 actually publishes articles and then invites reviewers to come and review those pieces after they're out on the website. It's still a fairly kind of, I find, slow process. It's a more transparent process. And we're not quite sure what's going to happen to Faculty 1000 because it was acquired by Taylor and Francis in 2020. And if we've seen what, for example, has happened with Publons, which is another one that was acquired by Web of Science, it's really is changing and not necessarily healthy ways. I think, I don't know, maybe I'm being too cynical. So Faculty of 1000 is one model of post-publication peer review that's been around. Another one, of course, are preprint servers. Preprint servers are where faculty can put articles, posters, and so on before they're actually gone through the peer review process. Most notably, arXiv is one that was started in 2008, and it's had a number of offshoots like bioRxiv that was started in 2013, and medical archive that was started in 2018. So it's a free online archive of unpublished work. In the social sciences, we also have like SSRN. A lot of these are offered through the Center for Open Science. And the idea is, like, instead of having manuscripts clogged up in the journal kind of peer review process, let's get them out there and get information out there quickly. Of course, in the pandemic, this has led to bad information about COVID, whether it be ivermectin treatments and so on. So while traditional peer review was already changing before the pandemic and pandemic publishing, the last year to several years have demonstrated real challenges to peer review and given us new ways, I think, also about teaching peer review, which is a point I'll come back to at the end of this section. So what's new? So I'm going to say, I'm sorry for kind of the amount of text on this slide. There's a really interesting website called Reimagine Review, and it lists a number of experiments in peer review. So it's a registry of peer review experiments intended to increase the visibility of these different experiments. And it grew out of a February 2018 meeting held for scientists, funders, and publishers at HHMI, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in Maryland. And one of the impetuses behind this early on was to think about how do different kinds of peer review affect different groups differently. So really kind of doing experiments on peer review. I'm going to talk about two of these that I think are really interesting in the context of pandemic publishing. And the first one is this one. It's called Rapid Reviews COVID-19, or RR:C19. And in a piece published in 2020 in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, Vilas Diar, Amy Brand, and Stefano Bertozzi describe it, the challenge of preprint archives, such as bioRxiv and medRxiv, are an important way, right, to create a more timely, open, and inclusive access to new science. And it's clear, though, that we need rapid, transparent peer review that allows reviewers, authors, and readers to engage with one another and for dynamic use of technology to accelerate publishing timelines without reducing academic rigor or researcher accountability. So the way that they're trying to do this in this experiment of rapid reviews COVID-19, and in their new one, rapid reviews for infectious diseases, is as follows. So here's, for example, of what the page looks like. If you click on the website, again, established in 2020, you see these different reviews that have been published, right? How do they get those articles to have reviews done? Well, they have a natural language processing algorithm that crawls across the different preprint servers and tries to identify what they think are timely and important articles that they want to then submit for reviews through the Rapid Reviews website. So they really, the reviews that I'll show you in just a minute are short reviews, really centered around two questions. Is this preprint reliable and is it trustworthy? And the idea is that the algorithm is going to find relevant, timely articles, bring them over. They're going to then find reviewers, that same pool of peer reviewers that journals will use, and then within 1 month, get a very short, kind of like quick, punchy kind of review out there to say, yep, this is good or not good. And I think this could potentially be very good, for example, for media sources. Where do I find good information on COVID-19? So here's what one of these looks like. So on the website, if you went to the page here on the left, let's just take this. Here's reviews. Here's an article about COVID-19 vaccination and menstrual cycle length in the Apple Women's Health Study. Right? So what are the reviews? If you click on that page, you come here to the page on the right. So there are 3 reviews that have been done on this one. And one is by Blair Darney at Oregon Health and Sciences University. Another one by Jacqueline Mabin at University of Edinburgh, and then Thomas Bouchard at University of Delhi. And you can see here that they give a little color-coded kind of review of them based upon the review. And they synthesize the reviews at the top. If we click just on the one by Blair Darney, it looks like this. And what I want you to see here is that her peer review is really short. Like, it's not like a typical 2-3 single-space page peer review that we might see. It's really just based around these kind of very core questions about the validity, kind of, and reliability of this particular study. And you see that she critiques what's actually happening in the study. She has some concerns about it. So I think this is really interesting because it's a way to kind of very quickly get some kind of quick kind of litmus test over these kind of articles that are coming in. This is another example of, I think, a really interesting innovation in peer review. And it's called the Patient and Public Partnership through the British Medical Journal. This was established in 2014. So it was before the pandemic, but it's interesting, it's been really deeply shaped by the pandemic. So the idea of this is that it's about bringing patients into the review of medical research. So if authors are involving patients in their work, they need to document exactly how they have involved patients and the public in their work. And they've actually have included patient reviews and public reviews in the public archive of this work. So, and as they've said in an editorial in just last year, 2021, the editors of the British Medical Journal said, patient review of research has become the norm, as has inviting patients and carers to co-write and comment on articles. In 2019 to 2020, over 80% of British Medical Journal research papers were reviewed by patients, and 85% of commissioned educational articles were co-produced with patient and patient advocates. They continue to talk about the way that the pandemic has evidence that we really need to have public voices, and whose voices are heard and whose voices are lost has been dramatically illustrated in the COVID-19 pandemic. So to put a finer point on this about what this actually looks like in terms of a peer review, this is an example of one that was posted on risk of preterm birth, small for gestational age at birth, and stillbirth after COVID-19 vaccination during pregnancy, population-based retrospective cohort study. So this was a study that was put by some Canadian researchers to understand if vaccinations had any effect on birth complications, birth weights of women, babies, excuse me. And what you see is that typically this would go through some kind of expert review. But what's really interesting is because this portal, this experiment really invites a patient perspective on open peer review, you see an example of what that looks like on the right side. And this is a graduate student from China who wrote a review of the article. And it begins, right? Dear editor, as a mother myself, giving birth to my daughter in 2020, right after the outbreak of COVID-19 in China, was quite an experience of anxiety, uncertainty, and overcautiousness. I sincerely appreciate the efforts of the research team for this outstanding population-based retrospective cohort study. And she goes on. Ultimately, she goes on to critique the technical content of it as well. But I just found this really fascinating that this experiment is inviting a very human aspect and a very public aspect of peer reviews in scientific communication. I'm really interested to see how it continues to play out. So what does this mean for the ways that I think we can innovate peer review? A couple of things I think are important here. First one is, I think it's really useful to use open peer reviews as potential models for students when we're trying to teach them professional peer review. Right? If you've taught scientific communication for any amount of time, you're always trying to scramble like, oh, whose friend can I get to borrow their peer review of the article? I need that example from that grant and so on. But open peer reviews allow us to find really good models of peer review that students can actually then see, like, how do professionals in the field talk about each other's work. And likewise, you can actually experiment with different types of peer review in classes. And I think break from what students bring in is oftentimes an English department model, which is like, oh, we're going to fill out a worksheet and so on. No, you can do experiments with single blind or double blind or open peer review, rapid versus slow reviews, and begin to ask questions about who's benefiting from this, who's not benefiting, what's actually happening here. What do I think about this? What do I see is going on? Thirdly, I think it's useful to have students actually engage with preprints and publish on them with comments. The one experiment I showed you just a minute ago from the British Medical Journal, there's undergraduate students that post replies to articles out there. I think that's a really nice way to break that barrier that students oftentimes feel between kind of the experts and themselves. Like, let's go out there and actually engage them in the public sphere with what's happening on preprint servers. And finally, I think it's really important for us in these kind of micro moments in our classes to kind of teach students about the complexity of peer review, and from an editor's point of view, from disciplinary points of view, as well as those from our own personal views as an authors about how do we navigate kind of conflicting reviews and so on. Kind of like thinking about like, what are the choices I'm making if I'm going to put something on a preprint server, or if I'm going to wait for a post-publication peer review, if I'm going to go through a normal peer review process, what I could think of traditional peer review process. This kind of opening up these different kinds of ways of thinking about peer review and I think are really useful for students to begin to think about in the terms of professional practice. So the second thing today that I want to talk about is the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the racial reckoning within the sciences, I think related to that. Of course, the Black Lives Matter predated the pandemic. The pandemic, though, really it showed us how health inequities play out in terms of deaths related to COVID-19. So, and as I talk here for just a minute, think about this. How do you think the scientific community has been affected by greater awareness to social inequities? Within your own spaces, what you're seeing from your students bringing in, or within your own disciplines, kind of what kind of conversations are happening? I think conversations are happening in very different ways, depending upon what the disciplinary context is. So I'd be interested in hearing more about that later on. So the Black Lives Matter movement and the COVID-19 pandemic have definitely awakened a greater understanding about the relevance of racism and social justice to science and in science, racism in science for sure. And this, you see a number of articles that have been published on this. This is a piece by Marcia McNutt that was done in 2020, if I remember correctly, is when it was. So she is the president of the National Academy of Sciences. And she talks about, I think it's telling here on what she puts on the right side. She says, by first admitting that science has been part of the problem, and she goes on from there, right? So, but when the president of the proceedings of the National Academy of the National Academy of Sciences signals this in editorials, it really sends a message to the profession, right, that this matters, these flagship publications. And we've seen since the last several years, a number of publications that really touch on questions about racism in science, written by scientists. And I want to make that a real point that I think is important, not science journalism alone, but written by people in the disciplines themselves. So, for example, this one is from the Office of the President, University of Maryland, and the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Maryland. This is authors who, for example, in PNS, called this time that we're in a Sputnik moment, one that allows us to reimagine the role of science in our society and elevates the importance of inclusion within the scientific community. And has example practices that the scientific community can to take to make the practices less racist and more inclusive. For example, we can adopt, they say, practice initiatives and models that have been successful in supporting students and faculty of color, included those cited in this article. For example, about mentoring, a practice and program working towards, we'll say, increasing the numbers of students and faculty of color, and so on. Another example of this one is, I think it's got a lot of traction. It's about 10 simple rules for building an anti-racist lab. For example, lead informed discussions about anti-racism in your lab regularly, address racism in your lab and field safety guidelines, which is really interesting, publish papers and write grants with BIPOC colleagues, and so on and so forth. So this comes from computational biology. And one other one I'll show you, I think this is a fun one. This is from Ecology and Evolution. This is a recreating Wakanda by promoting Black excellence in ecology and evolution. And they use the Wakanda symbol, right? And for example, different things that we can do, the folks within ecology and evolution can do to promote BIPOC faculty, students, and BIPOC kind of epistemological contributions. Finally, I'll just point this one out before I talk about the implications of all this. It just was recently published last month, a special issue of the journal Nature on racism, overcoming science's toxic legacy, with guest editors Melissa Nobles, Chad Womack, Ambrose Wonkman, and Elizabeth Wathuti. And as the editors of Nature say, among those worst excesses is racism in regards to scientific practices. For centuries, science has built a legacy of excluding people of color and those from historically marginalized groups from the scientific enterprise. Institutions and scientists have used research to underpin discriminatory thinking and have prioritized research outputs that ignore and further disadvantage marginalized people. The guest editors go on to write, science must at the same time become open to bringing in new voices and new points of view, and to working generally collaboratively with scientists from Black, Indigenous, and historically marginalized communities. There has to be space to be inclusive. So I find it so compelling that we're seeing these articles, not necessarily in Science Journal, but actually in scientific journals themselves, written by scientists. Likewise, we also begin to see efforts to decolonize science. Let me show you one example here that I think is really cool. So building on the idea of archive and bioarchive and so on, there's this initiative called Africa Archive, started in 2018, and it links through open science, and it links articles about Africa and by African scientists into this particular preprint archive. And you see here, since 2018, they have had more than 600 different submissions. And one of the things that's interesting about this particular archive that they go on to explain here, it's taking submissions in languages other than English. For example, it's taking submissions from Akan, Twi, Swahili, and Xhosa languages, so not just English languages. And you can see this is what the interface looks like through Science Open when you actually open it up. And you can do search and so on and so forth. So you can give articles plotted. Some of them are just the abstracts are posted. Sometimes it's the entire article that's posted. So I think this kind of initiative is a really kind of nice way to make a kind of different kind of use, a decolonial use out of preprint servers. So the scientific community's awareness to injustice is opening new ways of teaching scientific contents. So how do we bring that down to the classroom cases? And I think here's a good example from the Royal Society of Chemistry, who writes, they have a whole section now on decolonizing chemistry teaching and learning on their website. They write, decolonizing chemistry curriculums is about more than including Black, Asian, other and minoritized ethnic scientists in our lessons. It means considering not just the scientists' work, but the context of when and where they're working and their views, and doing that for all those mentioned in our subject. And you see a series of topics that they cover on this particular website. Likewise, we're beginning to see in scientific journals articles like this one from the folks at Department of Chemistry, University of York, decolonize the undergraduate chemistry curriculum, an account of how to start. It's interesting, this particular journal, the Journal of Chemical Education, I've seen a series of these kinds of articles in that journal, and so it's very exciting to see a journal really committed to that. As they say, these articles say, Caroline Dissent and her colleagues write, in the broadest sense, decolonization involves identifying colonial systems, structures, and relationships and working to challenge them. For the field of science, it suggests that we should question our understanding of science as something that grew solely from the discoveries of a series of famous Western individuals. Instead, we should recognize that there are colonial roots in science that can arise from both commerce and imperialism. The aim of decolonization science there is to then include more global voices and different kinds of histories in kind of the production of scientific knowledge and the histories of scientific knowledge. In addition to thinking about content changes in the curriculum, this work on the Black Lives Matter movement has also, I think, informed new language guidelines that are really important for anybody teaching scientific communication. For example, there are the new American Psychological Association's equity, diversity, inclusion guidelines that include not just terms for population, but also include, for example, terms for racism, that include structural racism, institutional racism, and so on. In addition, they have a number of other, I think, really useful information in this about thinking about how we name populations of people. And I'm going to point to this particular slide here because I find this resonates a lot when I teach students about new language inclusion guidelines, about person-first language. So instead of saying a victim or a survivor, you could say a person who has experienced X. Or instead of saying a homeless person, you say a person without housing or a person who is currently experiencing homelessness and so on. So it's this move to person-first language because their homelessness does not define their whole identity. It's just oftentimes a particular moment in time that a person is experiencing homelessness, right? In addition to the APA guidelines, there are also guidelines now from the American Medical Association, and these are called A Guide to Language, Narrative, and Concepts. They write, the majority of us have the right intentions in place. We wish to see improved health outcomes for all, yet the evidence, the science shows that even despite great intentions, some decisions made at the practice and institutional level and by individuals themselves are not meeting our intended desired impact to ensure the full potential of optimal health for our patients. Most alarmingly, there are signs some of our systems continue to exert harm, creating and perpetuating inequities. We shared this document with humility. We recognize that language evolves, and we are mindful that context always matters. This guide is not and cannot be a checklist of correct answers. Instead, we hope that this guide will stimulate critical thinking about language, narrative, and concepts, helping readers to identify harmful phrasing in their own work and providing alternatives that move us toward racial justice and health equity. So it's very much an aspirational document. What I like about this particular guide is not do they suggest new terms, for example, on the left side. So instead of saying illegal immigrant, we say undocumented immigrant. And then the reason why is added there. And then later on in the guide, they show how to use these terms in sentences. It's not a perfect formulation, but I like that this particular guide doesn't just say, here's a term, but also has phrases and whole kind of patterns of language for which to use terms in. I think it just provides a kind of much richer kind of way of thinking about linguistic justice and language guidelines to do this kind of work in the disciplines. In the end, reckoning with injustice, with racial injustice, has, I think, these important implications for the way that we teach scientific communication. For one, ask students to read from researchers in their own field about how their field is addressing injustice. So how are the physicists thinking about this? How are the psychologists thinking about this? These disciplinary conversations are just really, really intriguing. Secondly, allow space for larger conversations about the history and ethics of scientific practice in scientific courses and even scientific communication courses. And I was thinking this morning about kind of ways that this can be done in kind of micro ways. So for example, when I taught at MIT for 10 years, and I taught with a faculty member named Dennis Freeman in the Department of Computer and Electrical Engineering, EECS. Right. And he was talking, we do a lot of biomedical work, talking about that. And he would talk to students about clinical trials. And for example, with AZT trials, how the trials were shut down early because it was shown to be so effective. And it's thought about this as kind of micro moment within talking about how clinical trials work, where you can say, here's an example of kind of show kind of a justice-oriented moment within this larger conversation. These micro moments, I think, are really useful to kind of open up small spaces in curriculum, what we oftentimes feel are really packed, but do in ways that are really impactful in those small ways. Thirdly, I think we need to encourage students to analyze their citational paths and explore a greater range of research from researchers on sites like Africa Archive, right? Really thinking about kind of what is that, kind of who are you citing, why are you citing them, where are you finding that information? The racial reckoning of habeas science really opens us up in really interesting ways instead of just always running towards kind of the high impact journals only as places to find information. We can find information in a lot of different kinds of ways. And finally, I think as we teach scientific communication, we want to teach language change and why it matters to scientific research, right? When you're thinking about data interpretations, it matters a lot about how we're naming the populations if we're doing human subjects work. Like how we call populations, like really says so much about them when we do those data interpretations about what kind of meanings we make from them, and we are taking a deficit-based or an asset-based approach to naming populations. And my final piece today, I want to talk about global science beyond English. So the question is that talk today, this piece I'd like for you to think about is, given that most scientists are not native speakers of English, in fact, most speakers in the world today of English are not native speakers of English, how does the scientific community need to think about what I'm going to call linguistic flexibility? To put a point of history on this, there's this nice piece by Hamill that was published in 2007 that shows, right, English has not been the lingua franca of science through at least since 1880, as he charted research publications, and that you see it's really only in the 20th century after World War I, and then really after World War II, that English really becomes to dominate scientific practice and scientific publications. Today, there's been a lot of research in the last 10, 15 years by people like Mary Jane Curry and Teresa Lillis, among others, Christine Tardy, David Hanauer, Karen Englander, on the role of English in disciplinary, particularly scientific publication. As Lillis and Curry have reminded us that the pressure to produce in English constitutes a significant dimension to multilingual scholars' lives. There's a huge push for scholars globally to publish in English, and oftentimes that is given more prestige for the purposes of promotion of tenure. And likewise, high impact journals are often published only in English. Some of them have gone to translations of abstracts, but not necessarily. So we're seeing the most high, what's considered high impact research being kind of enforced through this de facto mono English kind of publishing policy. Not all journals, but you look at how much of it is being published in English only, it's really kind of striking when you actually look at it. Right. And as a piece that was just published by Solar has said, if the odd features of English, quote unquote, odd feature that the reader identifies in the manuscript when reviewers or peer reviewing are construed as problematic and need fixing or polishing, these perceptions may likely influence editors' overall evaluations of the manuscript. I will say here, we know a lot from writing research that reviewers go off the rubrics all the time, that this is not this is well known in writing assessment research. While a cause-effect relationship between unusual features or rejection of an article cannot be established, Lillis and Curry show that when reviewers construe English or language as problematic, these representations add to the overall rationale for rejection by the editor. So this kind of additional burden that multilingual scholars face if their linguistic practices are somehow deemed as both, first of all, identified and then deemed as problematic or unusual. These difficulties, though, David Hanauer and Karen Englander remind us, though, are not just situated in the linguistic abilities of second language researchers, right? That's what we see when we think about like the problem of multilingual publishing, but that is oftentimes not actually what's all going on. So it's not just the linguistic demands of publishing in English, it actually goes much more deeper than that to, for example, we see lack of access to research writing resources, lack of access to professional networks, lack of access to publication support, hence things like Africa Archive are really important, or Silo, which is the Latin American one, right? And peer review processes, particularly again, peer review processes in which researchers feel they're going to be discriminated against, as work by James Cochran has pointed out in 2019. And finally, just simply the emotional toll that so many global multilingual scholars feel when they are told that they must publish in English. So what is to actually be done here? This is I think James Cochrane has a really nice point here. He says there is an ethical imperative for science writing gatekeepers and literacy brokers and so on, policymakers, to actively address plurilingual English as additional language scientists' perceptions of inequity. So really making statements in advance that will address those perceptions of inequity. And there was a piece by McKinley and Rose that was published in 2018 that was looking at how journals are trying to address those perceptions of inequity in advance, rather than just kind of like generic statements, right? They're actually putting those in their policies and their submissions guidelines. And I like this a lot. For example, Nature Nanotechnology has the policy that says, Nature Nanotechnology is read by scientists from diverse backgrounds. In addition, many are not native English speakers. Authors should therefore give careful thought to how their findings may be communicated clearly. No paper will be rejected for poor language. Now, we can say that the whole idea of poor language construction there is a problem, but I like the kind of the idea here that we're not going to reject your work because of kind of linguistic difference. And in fact, in more recent work, there's been this move. For example, there was this issue of Journal of English for research publication purposes, where there's a statement by a number of these researchers who I just have cited on questioning English as a lingua franca of scientific and academic context. And they write, we aim to challenge assumptions made about the use of English as lingua franca in scientific academic context, identify the impact of such assumptions on trajectories of knowledge production and uptake, and legitimize the use of multiple languages for transnational scholarly exchange. I think this is really exciting, and I was going to do a quick anecdote here in my last few minutes that I have. I'm going to finish up. There was just a piece that came in. Again, I'm going to be an incoming editor of a journal, January 1st. Journal called Written Communication. A piece had come in, and it was a piece about a Moroccan, North African agronomics journal in which the abstracts are translated across languages. But what they are now doing is that the translations are not just simply like parallel translations, but they're thinking about different readerships for those different abstracts. So the Arabic abstract is much more for like a public kind of policy making audience. That this is really, really powerful way to think about kind of multilingualism and purpose plurality, as we might call it, within academic publishing. So this statement by Federico Navarro and colleagues identifies 10 ways, things we need to think about and assumptions, and we say that English is the lingua franca of scientific communication. I'll show you a couple other things that I think are exciting that happen, because their work dovetails with the UNESCO recommendations on open science that was published last year in 2021, in which open science is not just about increasing scientific contributions and collaborations or increasing scientific knowledge, but as well as making multilingual scientific knowledge openly available. So open science, at the heart of open science is this idea that multilingualism has a place. It is really critical. It's one of those 3 pillars that we're going to define open science by. So open science is about knowledge and about communication to make the scientific work better. This group has, so out of open science, sorry, so the transition here. Another thing, thinking about this work, there was this interesting statement by the Helsinki Initiative on Multilingualism, in which this group, which was started in 2019, and notice the Africa Archive is out there as one of the organizations that has supported this initiative. It's looking at thinking about kind of multilingualism in academic and scholarly publications, scientific publications. And this group has had some really interesting presentations that they've done. And one that I particularly liked, there was a piece in it by Laura Rovelli, who is she's a political scientist from Argentina, but she does a lot of work on like indexing of academic work. And she was talking about how, for example, preprint servers like Silo, or kind of, they're not a preprint server, but kind of a collection of kind of journals that publish in Spanish language from Latin America and Central America. She says ranking systems, right, don't capture a lot of those kind of journals. So she was talking about the way that we need to rethink impact factors and rankings and so on to do a better capture of journals that are working across languages. I think this work is really exciting to think about how we can create what she is calling about kind of creative bibliometrics work. Oh, one last one I will show you as I finish today. And this is one called Masakane. This is a natural language processing grassroots effort by African scholars. So they are trying to do a couple things. One, they're trying to do decolonizing scientific work. They're also, show you this one. So for example, they're also trying to, one of the ways they're trying to do that is to think about African terms for concepts. So not all words have African, like a Xhosa translation. So what would be a Xhosa word for example, for dinosaur? To see an example here. So they also aim to translate 180 scientific papers from their preprint server into 6 different African languages. The Decolonized Science Project is one of many initiatives that the Masakani group is undertaking. Others include detecting hate speech in Nigeria and teaching machine language algorithms to recognize African names and places. And I think that is actually really interesting. If anybody has done any AI work, you know, like they're trained on data sets, right? And oftentimes the data sets are white normative data sets that don't include kind of multilingual samples in them at all. So this is one of the initiatives, the Masakani initiative is trying to do that work in exciting ways. It's getting nice press there from Nature in 2021. So at the end of the day, making scientific publishing more linguistically flexible and more socially just. I think it's useful for students as we teach scientific communication to review scientific journal submission guidelines. Like, what do the journals actually say about language? Who's using inclusive and who's using exclusive language when we think about multilingual writers? Second of all, ask students to read research across languages. If your university has a foreign language requirement, there's no reason why students can't go out and try to attempt reading some research written in other languages. And what do they learn by reading science in other languages? I think it's a very useful exercise for them to do that. Third, embrace a more flexible linguistic approach to scientific communication that attends to multiple dimensions of publishing across languages, right? And that I'm thinking about terms of like what's all happening in terms of rankings and so on, kind of what's actually happening. And we move scientific communication across languages. And finally, create bibliodiverse assessment indicators. That's if you're like really out there and really kind of question impact factors and so on. In conclusion today, I want to leave you with one thought, which I think is, I think all these changes in scientific communication are really exciting. The COVID-19 pandemic and global reckoning with racial inequity have deeply changed scientific practice and communication. Students need to know about conventions for scientific research articles, posters, grants, and so on. So they need to know that state now, like Joanna talked about last presentation, but they need to understand how science is changing. Understanding changes to scientific practice and publishing, scientific communication will better prepare our students for working in the global scientific community and build a more just world through science. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. This was absolutely fantastic, and fits in really, really well with a lot of the ethos of the work that's going on at MSU, especially in our writing center, about challenging previously held notions of linguistic standards in writing and the ways we move each other forward in solidarity. So I have opened up the Q&A for folks who are on the call. If you'd like to submit a question, please do. You can also ask questions in the chat. You can raise your hand. My camera is off at the moment because my internet is really wobbly at this time. So I'll ask Nicole and Orville to give me an assist if it seems like I should be talking and I'm not. But let's give folks a second to generate some questions and to sit with all these great materials. So
yeah, I was just going to say, as people have questions, like if you want to talk about their own positionality, like if you're a tutor or you're a teacher in the disciplines and so on, I'm really interested from hearing from folks from different kinds of backgrounds and different kind of stakes in this conversation.
We'll give folks a second to digest and think. Oh, we've got our first question in the Q&A. Let's see. Will my computer allow me to load it? So we have a question. Do you know of examples of community members beyond patients being invited to review publications?
Sure. So one of the other ones I was looking at the BMJ is like the Professional Organization of Midwives that was responding to a study about COVID-19 and midwifery. So there's different ways I think that community members can be brought into this conversation. So it doesn't have to be like an N of one. I know there's a real risk. Well, like you're a single patient talking about this. But there's different groups that can come together that also look at the work and make commentary back about the work. All right. So do you want me to just read the next question? I will. All right, so, and this one comes from Samantha. She says, like, hello, thank you for the presentation. I work with a lot of the graduate students in hard sciences through our writing center, and my question is in regard to their confidence in their English ability. How would you recommend discussing the changing landscape of scientific writing if their advisors and PIs are critical of their English ability? Right, I think with that, you need to think about, this needs to happen on multiple levels. One is the writing across the curriculum folks really need to be working with faculty across the disciplines to be thinking about how these standards are changing within the disciplines. I find that folks that are really engaged in publishing are aware of what's happening. So that I will say, Samantha, I think that would have been a harder conversation 10 years ago than it is now. When I taught at MIT from 2000 to 2010, like English as lingua franca was the narrative that was used. But now we're seeing so many other things happening that I think that this is where we need to have more conversations with faculty in the disciplines to talk about that. And then we can have work for our students, and we can do things, for example, like putting informational flyers together in writing centers and so on, like 5 facts that are interesting facts about scientific communication today that they can take with them and do that work. We can also, I would say, if you're thinking not just graduate students, but undergraduate students, getting in classes where undergraduate classes where scientific communication is being taught, like if you're in a writing program, like those classes need to address these issues for sure. And I'll just say one other thing about this, Samantha, which is some disciplines I find move ahead faster than other disciplines. In general, I find like some of the disciplines that work with patients and people populations move ahead because they're always dealing with people. Other disciplines, maybe like astrophysics, may be further behind, maybe not. I could be completely wrong. I just want to know that, I want to think about each discipline kind of working in its own way to wrestle with these different kinds of issues for the kinds of topics they write about and the kind of populations that they work with. And this one comes from Claire. This was a bit like drinking from a fire hose. Thank you. Yeah, Claire, I'm sorry. That's why the slides are available. I'm sure the answer is in your slides, but if you could recommend a most important thing for professional scientific and technical writers, those at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory where I work, to do in light of these observations, what would that be? I think that we need to think, Claire, of a couple things. One is I think that they need to stop insisting that students, writers have perfect English before you can get something published. Like that's just not helpful. It's stopping people professionally from getting out there. I think looking at what those changes are in the field is important. Looking at journals that are accepting of multilingual writing is important, and getting those of us who serve on all these editorial boards or journal editors, push us as your own editors and editorial boards to make those spaces more welcoming for multilingual writers. The other thing I would say, for example, for those folks that you work with, is to understand like that there's no going back to pre-pandemic time. Things have changed, and how much things will change will depend upon different disciplines, but things have changed. And that rate of publication, for example, that's not going to change. It's just really stunning the way that kind of this churn is just this acceleration of scientific knowledge that started before the pandemic. The pandemic just really turbocharged there. Isn't going to change, and the fields have to think about what that means for preprints, post-publication peer review, preprint reviews, and so on, and how, like, what do they, folks like at the Jet Propulsion Lab, like what's most useful for them? Thank you for that question. And this is Dawn. She says, I'm a professional writing tutor from Marymount Manhattan College. I am interested about Chinese publication in science. So, Don, I will say a couple of things about that. I've done some work with my collaborator, Chen Zhang Wu. And we're looking at a couple of different things. So one is it's really interesting, the number of Chinese authors that publish actually in English. So we're looking at then where are the uptakes of that scholarship? So what is coming over into English? Why are they choosing to publish in English? Where is that then being cited? What is that sphere of influence? It's one. Two, what kind of Chinese language publications are starting to appear? Are those being supported by the government? So what kind of infrastructure is being put in place? And three, this is a really interesting thing we've been following, which is you get these uptakes, as we think of genre uptakes, right? From technical stuff in English, but back into the Chinese language, like on Twitter and so on. So we're talking about having students trace those different kinds of uptakes into Twitter and how that information gets taken up and changed across languaging practices. So there's a lot of really interesting work to be done, and it'd be great to see more of it out there. This is from Kate. She says, is there a potential increased siloing, decreased communication between disciplines groups if different groups begin publishing in different languages, or do you foresee a secondary market of translated articles? This is a fabulous question, Kate, and I didn't get a chance to talk about the role of AI translation in this talk today. So a lot of these initiatives are really looking to natural language processing and what they're calling like semi-automatic translation. So our partial translations, so it gets languaging partially translated, and there's some additional work that's done beyond that. So I don't necessarily think that there's going to be siloing. I think as we're going to see this publishing kind of across languages happen at the same time that translation technology continues to improve across different languages. So I think it's really, really exciting to see these two things kind of working together. I don't know, so many journals still rely on paying translators to say, translate something from English into Spanish. That is not a sustainable model for a lot of journals. So we're going to really need a particular place for AI and for translation services. All right, we got a bunch more here of this great stuff. So Liz, I don't have a question, but I found this very interesting as a communications professional in the bioethics and social justice space here at MSU. Great, so thank you, Liz. Feel free to reach out. Awesome. Here's, here we go. This is from Claire. I can answer the rest of them in a Google Docs. So feel free to write more questions. I'll write back to you. This is from Claire. She says, regarding linguistic flexibility, doesn't it help to focus on higher order concerns like convincing science story rather than lower order concerns, like the continually problematic but trivial non-standard use of the articles? Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, Claire. This is really, right, this is where we need to be talking about questions about significance, impact, right, clarity of methods and so on, these higher order concerns when we teach scientific communication. That's definitely important. I would say with one caveat here is when we talk about populations of people, I want students to use, instead of, for example, homeless people or poor people, to using that person first language. Because again, I think how we talk about populations of people says a lot about what kinds of interpretations we think we can make about other groups of populations. So thank you so much all for coming today. I'm excited again to take more questions. We'll get back to you. And I want to thank Karen and the folks at Michigan State for having me today.
Thank you so much for joining us, Maya. I've actually just stolen Nicole's computer because it's working where mine is not. So I just did a mad dash across our center. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was so fabulous. Folks who asked extra questions we didn't get to answer yet, we did collect them all. We will be giving them to Dr. Poe, who will be answering them for you in a document that we've already put a link to in your information document from today. So you guys already have the link. We've also already sent out our post-event survey, so please fill that out. But again, Dr. Poe, this was fabulous. We're so grateful for your time, for the work you do, and for the ways you're challenging all of us to move the field forward. So thank you, thank you, thank you.